Hi, my name is Keith Knuth, and I'm going to give a demonstration on how to start a workflow from an API in Infor OS. If you did not know, Infor OS includes a robust API gateway, and the API gateway includes an ION API suite with workflow endpoints in it. You can connect from your application to the API gateway to trigger a workflow. So let's see how that works. I'm in the Infor OS portal and I've navigated to the API gateway. I've done that by clicking on the app switcher and selecting Infor ION API. The first screen in the gateway is a listing of all your available APIs. I can use the search at the top of the screen to search for ION, and I found the ION suite. If I double click on that, I'm presented with a list of endpoints that this suite provides. There are two endpoints for workflow, these two ION process endpoints. The first one, the application endpoint, is the one we want. So we'll click on the documentation for that. We're presented with the Swagger UI for this API endpoint. If you're not familiar with Swagger, it's a standard UI from a industry group to kind of help users no matter which type of API gateway or which API connection point they go to. The documentation is always the same and familiar to you. And a nice part of this is that you can actually the documentation is actually dynamic, meaning you can test the API right from this page. So at the bottom of the available methods is the workflow start API. We'll click on that to expand it and scroll down. You can see it gives me some information about this API, including that there's two inputs, a logical ID and a JSON body. And it gives me an example of how that JSON should be laid out. But like I said, I can also press the try it out button and actually execute this API. The first input, logical ID, if you don't know the format for that, it is lid, then Infor ION desk, and usually .1. Check with your system administrator to see how your environment is set up, but this is the typical lid or logical ID, the identifier for the ION application. The second input is this JSON body, and like I said, this generic JSON is given to you as just an example. Let me paste in my JSON. You can see that the JSON here gives the workflow name, in my case, KK test. The instance name, this is just the description and the name of this particular instance of the workflow that I'm about to start. It can be anything that you want. And then in case that I have input variables that the workflow requires, I can list those as well. My workflow takes variables, but they all have default values, so I can run without them. Let's press the execute button. And you can see down below in the server response section, I got a code 200, which is great. That means it was successful. And it's returning the ID of the workflow that was started. Perfect. It worked successfully. If I wanted to change this and my workflow did require input, here's an example of how that input variable section of the JSON would look. It would just include the name. In my case, the name of the variable is company, the data type, which is a string, and the value, which is 345. And I can execute that. And again, I should get a 200. Yep, and the ID was 566. Okay, so we've found the API. We've seen the format and the syntax to execute the API. Now let's bring up an API client and actually test this from outside Infor OS. I'm going to use the popular API client called Postman. It's free. You can just Google Postman and download clients for Windows and Mac and Linux. This could be your own code, your own application that you're writing, but I'm going to use Postman just because it's so popular and easy to use. You can see that I've opened up the client and I've chosen the post operation because back in the API gateway, it told me that the start workflow method was a post method. And then it needs to know the endpoint that I'm going to connect to. So back in the API gateway, when I look at this, I can either copy it right from here, the slash v1 workflow start, or if I want the whole thing, I can go down to this request URL and grab everything right here, copy, and paste that in to this field right here. Okay. Then to complete my setup in the Postman client, I need to walk through these tabs here. The first one beginning with params. This first parameter is going to be where I store my logical ID. You can see I've already written that in, logical ID and value, just like I had put it in to the Swagger UI. All right. The second tab is authorization. This is where I fill in my token for the OAuth 2 connection to the gateway. If you don't know how that works, you can do your own research on how OAuth 2 authorizations work. But basically, I need to fill in the callback URL, auth URL, client ID, secret, access token URL, all from a credentials file that the API gateway gives me when I set up an authorized application. More information on that is available in the API gateway documentation or other videos online from Infor. Make sure you choose the send as basic auth header, then request the token. It may ask you to enter your credentials. I just did recently, so it's just asking me to allow the access. And now I have a new fresh token to do my test with. The headers tab, you do not need to do anything here. Postman fills in everything for you, except make sure this content type is application/JSON. And then in the body, this is where I fill in most of the information. You can see I filled in the JSON that we already had pasted into the API Gateway Swagger UI with my name and my instance name for this test. And that's all you need. Make sure, sorry, one more thing, make sure you have the raw option selected here for the JSON as well. That's all we need. Now we can hit send. And you can see we got back a successful response with an ID of 567. Okay, so there's a successful test from an API client. Back in Infor OS, if I wanted to see if I really did create a workflow and not just trust the result from the API call, I could go into the ION desk and select from the left-hand menu, monitors and workflows, and then active workflows. And I'm going to get a report of all my workflows that are running in the system. And at the top, I can search by my workflow name, KK Test, and I can see that KK Test is running. I have 14 instances of workflows running. And if I select this row, I can click on workflow instances and get a list. They're in sequential order, so the bottom one is the newest. And sure enough, 567 is the ID that I got back from my Postman client. And if I hover over this source icon, I can see that, yep, this workflow was kicked off from an API call. Now, we went through this example very quickly. There's much more information in three sources. The Swagger documentation in the API gateway itself, we saw that. You can read more information about the examples it gives there. The Ion Desk user guide, you can access that on docs.infor.com. And also our API gateway SDK on GitHub. That URL is github.com/inforcloud. If you go to that website and scroll down to the ION API SDK, you'll find our open source code examples that is shared freely with you to understand how to connect to the API gateway and how to do that OAuth 2 authorization.